Hey Cyrus,
How you doing, Chief?
not bad.
Excellent. So today let's just talk a little bit about conflict and how it's an integral to a story.
Sure.
I think conflict is one of those things that can really drive a story from the beginning, middle, and end.
Yes.
It can be a little bit difficult sometimes to define it
Oh, yeah.
because it's not just an action scene
No, it's not.
or just sort of having people go and check off a lot of boxes and doing things.
No.
But it's really the central thing that takes the character from where they are at the beginning and sort of pushes them into the rest of the story.
Yes. Yeah, from beginning to end. What your character is dealing with, what are the obstacles, and what are the things they have to overcome.
Sure.
Kind of like you said, it's not just about two guys fighting. It's not the conflict. You have a main character who wants to get a girl. How does he get together with her? Forms a series of conflict.
Sure.
How he deals with his friends, and then try to maybe win her love and all that kind of stuff. That's all sorts of conflict being set up for that.
Sure.
So it happens. Not just an action story, but even in romance comedy being a good one. Even historical tales can have stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's just talk about just the general types of conflicts that you can
Sure.
have. In general, people say there are about 4 really major ones that you can name. Could you just name those off?
Yeah, there's man versus the world,
Sure.
or man versus society. Either way, it's the same thing. Man versus nature, man versus man, and then man versus himself.
Sure.
I think a good example would have a multitude of that with something like Groundhog Day.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yes.
I really love that movie. It's a comedy, and so
Sure.
it perfectly shows that you don't have to have an action sequence to have
Yes.
conflict. He's stuck in the same day
Yes.
over and over again. He has terrible relationships with everyone he
Yes.
is with. He can't attract the woman that he really likes.
Yes.
And he has a difficult time just sort of enjoying life because he's extra cynical about everything.
Yes.
He can't be sincere about anything.
Yes.
And so all of those together sort of leave him in the same space that he's going through over and over again. So after he milks the day and does everything that he could possibly do to enjoy himself,
Yes.
he's still left empty.
Oh yeah. See, that's an interesting movie where it has multiple of conflict, where he has man versus himself being a dominant thing, where he's
Sure.
trying to become a better person in the process. There's man versus man, him dealing with other characters, trying to win the woman over is also a man versus man scenario. And then there's man versus the world, where he's kind of trapped in this thing that happens over and over and he
Right.
can't get out of. So it's quite interesting. It's really one of the best movies out there that creates conflict throughout the entire movie. And it's almost presenting the same conflict over and over, but in different scenarios as
Right.
well.
It's pretty entertaining.
Yes.
Another great example of this is the serialized versions of James Bond.
Yes.
We've had, 23, 24 movies?
And I think 25 at this point.
It's a
something
lot
like
of
that. Yeah,
movies.
Yeah.
But, the same concepts keep on coming over and over again.
Yes.
He has a very simple conflict that he keeps on having to, do. He's a spy. He has to save the world
Yes.
or Britain or whatever it is, and he has to overcome his enemy.
Yes.
Pretty simple, and they come up with some pretty creative plots
Yes.
throughout, but in general, it's pretty clear what he has to do.
Yes. I think action movies are easier to define what their conflicts are.
Sure.
Because you clearly have a good guy and you have a bad guy. The audience have no trouble following what's going on.
Sure.
We're rooting for the good guy to beat the bad guys at the end, whether it's his scheme or his henchmen.
Right.
So there's very simple visual elements. The tougher part is something that goes into a little bit more philosophical. Luther comic book that I did was kind of like that. It was really a man versus himself situation. Man versus himself, and then man versus what God wants him to do is another dominant thing in that. And those are harder to present as conflicts because you don't see them so clearly, and you have to define that for the audience. Takes
Sure.
a little bit more finesse in the process.
A good example of this for me would be Crash. Have you seen that movie?
Yes, I've seen Crash.
See, I'm iffy on that movie.
Okay.
There are certain parts about it that I really like. I think there's some great scenes.
Yes.
But because it has so many different characters and it doesn't have a standard, narrative,
Yes.
I find it a little bit difficult sometimes to just identify with it. And so there's a lot of tension between characters, and
Yes.
there's obviously a lot of difficulties between people, and they have a central theme.
Yes.
But sometimes I don't think the conflict is always necessarily there because it doesn't build the way a normal story would.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Crash because Crash came out in a time when a lot of Hollywood movies was doing that type of storytelling.
Sure.
Traffic being another one, where it's kind of you have a dominant theme of drugs, affecting people's life, but in there they're peppered with little stories involved. But it's kind of one of those type of movie that Hollywood don't focus on as much anymore. But during that time period, there was a lot more of that type of movies that were coming out.
Right. And so, the 3-act structure is something that a lot of people do, or some people call it a 5-act structure, whatever, it's fine.
Yes.
Those tend to be a little bit more simple because you have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yes.
And it's pretty straightforward how the story is going to progress. Even if you don't necessarily know all the beats,
Sure.
you have somewhat of an expectation.
Yes.
Sometimes when it's moving around another way, it can be harder to, properly pace and define the
Sure.
conflict.
Sure. But quite often it's like the greater you can make the conflict, the more interesting it becomes.
Yes.
It's funny. Another movie that falls in that category to talk about is like Pulp Fiction.
Yes.
There's no real linear timeline. Things are kind of broken into pieces, and there's just little scenarios happening. But each one of them has their own unique conflict.
Yes.
And sometimes it gets very, very violent.
Yes.
It's kind of what makes Tarantino movies good. It's because he would create characters, etc., and then just make them kind of almost go into a car crash situation.
Yes.
And you never know what goes flying in the process.
Mm-hmm.
So conflict is very, very, very important. How you as a writer or creator needs to control those aspects to make your story interesting.
Sure.
Make your characters have to go through obstacles, sometimes moral obstacles, sometimes physical obstacles.
Well, you also have to think about it like this too. Some conflicts are only interesting for particular characters, right?
Yes.
And so they're made for that particular character. And then anyone could be dropped into, and
Yes.
it would be interesting.
Yes.
So you'll see disaster movies, for example.
Yes.
Literally the whole world or wherever
It's
it's being
falling apart.
affected is
Yeah.
falling apart.
Yeah.
And everyone sort of has to defend themselves together and try
Sure.
to survive together. And so it's not just man against man at that point.
Yeah.
It's also man against his environment or
Oh,
nature.
man against rest in nature. Yes, that is something like that. But I think disaster movies are much simpler.
Yes.
Because you know what the obstacle is.
It's existential.
Yeah, everyone can see it. As an audience, you can go, okay, I can see a plane is crashing. You have to get away from that, or the road is tearing itself apart. We got to keep driving before we fall into the cracks in the hole.
Yeah.
I think those are very easy conflicts to define
Sure.
visually for the audience. Nothing's wrong. No, not that it's wrong. But how exciting can you make those things, and how smart the character get themselves in those situations I think is kind of the key to writing something like that.
Right. And I think it's pretty exciting how they can do that in all different kinds of ways. I feel the zombie movies are almost an extension of these disaster movies.
Sure.
Because it's a pandemic of some sort.
Yes.
And you're not only just fighting, your inner feelings about having to kill another man.
Yes.
It's the fact that, it's now not just about your safety, it's about everyone's safety.
Yes.
Because it can spread now. And so you have to survive, you have to defend, and these beings aren't exactly thinking or feeling
No.
in the way in which you normally think about it.
Well, yeah. Well, that once again incorporates man versus himself.
Yes.
Man versus man. Characters may want to kill one another to survive. Man versus the world, because the world is falling apart, and even man versus nature.
Yes.
Where there's greater things that's happening that they have to overcome. Sometimes it's the weather. Sometimes, like you said, mindless zombies. They're not really the society. They are the nature that's kind of gone wrong.
Exactly.
So that's why I think zombie movies are very gets a lot of audience, very attractive to people, because it presents all these scenarios that you go, okay, how will I get myself out of that situation?
Yeah. It forces people to think.
Yeah, forces people to think.
In
too.
a very natural way. Well, there are some plots that are specific to a person.
Yes.
Like you'll see a movie like 13 Reasons Why that
Yes.
delves very strongly into depression. Or another great example of this would be Chasing Fire, or what's the other movie? The movie with Katniss Everdeen.
God, I can't say I remember the last two. I saw both of them in the theater, but
Sure.
yeah, not off the top.
Hunger Games, there we go.
Yeah.
Hunger Games, the main central reason why the conflict even begins is because she's trying to protect her sister.
Sure.
And that's the powder keg that starts everything else
Yes.
in the rest of the story. And so that story wouldn't have proceeded the same way if that wasn't a part of her character.
Yes.
And so all of those things together, I think, can help.
Oh yeah, well that's your typical man versus society scenario. You put yourself through all of that because the society is against you.
Yes.
Quite often it's interesting when I talk to people writing comic books and stuff like that, they don't talk about the conflict aspect. They just talk about I have a story, I have a hero, I have a villain. you kind of have understand the basics, but what is the ultimate conflict you're trying to put into your story? Like, for example, Captain China, it's kind of broken into two segments, in the entire first arc. The first half is definitely, Captain China as a character that's kind of fighting against the understanding of capitalism that's going on in China right now, and it's a sort of underlying thing of what the conflict is about.
Sure.
He's somebody who was from the old hardcore communist day, but now he's suddenly in the modern China where capitalism is running rampant. It's everywhere. Everything's about money. How does he maneuver through that? And then the second half of the story is really him fighting his past.
Sure.
All the relationship from past starts to come back and haunt him. So, I kind of knew what I wanted to do with that. So it was easier to define conflicts with the characters.
Right.
And then maneuver him through, and then who his supporting characters are. How is he either they're helping him or kind of present another obstacle in the setting was what was considered throughout.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
I feel, definitely that's what makes a part of the story so interesting.
Sure.
Is that there are many different avenues in which we can explore that conflict and
Yes.
it can be driven. Whether it's side characters or even villains or, particular circumstances that he's thrown into, more often than not, there's something that he has to overcome in order to, achieve his end goal or to become, the best version of himself that he can be.
Oh, yes. And it's the triumph over all these things.
The reason why we watch these is just so that we can get the catharsis at the end.
Sure.
We want to experience the roller coaster, but we want to finally see that final peak.
Yes.
And more often than not, when a story sort of falls off the rails and either loses that conflict
Yeah.
or it doesn't properly resolve it
Yeah.
with the rules that were established,
Sure.
it can be very frustrating
Oh,
for
yeah.
people.
Not properly defined and not properly resolved at the end. It's usually when audience go, what the heck was that
terrible.
all about? Yeah, this is what happens. It's unfortunate, but I think as anyone who wants to write create comic books, get involved in the process, that's a conflict is something you really want to define very early on in your project and know what you want to go with it. The better you can define it for yourself, you're better defining it for your readers and your audience.
Mm-hmm. The hard part too is not painting yourself into a corner,
No.
and not knowing where to go from there. So it's about making something that you can
Sure.
actually get out of without having to retcon something in
No,
at the last
no.
minute.
Well, that's why you gotta think things through thoroughly. It kind of like one of the other videos this we've discussed. I used to kind of write things very freeform, in a freeform format, and kind of just see how it goes. But then quite often I go, "Oh, I didn't set that up in the beginning." Now I kind of have to make it up as I go along.
Right.
But this is why I switched to writing, a full script first, and then go through revisions and letting other people read it and see, okay, what are some of the things I'm missing out on? That's okay. Make sure that we can tighten up everything. So at the end, you leave as little problems as you can out of it.
Sure, and that means that you also have to abide by a set of rules that you've established
Sure.
within the story.
Oh, yeah.
One of the worst things is when something comes out of left corner, left field that you just didn't see coming at all,
Oh, yeah.
and they never set it up, and it completely breaks the rules that they've established beforehand.
Oh yeah.
It's like, what am I watching this for? It's
Happens quite often in Japanese anime. At the end, they pull out this one secret object or weapon that can save the day, and you're like, that was never set up at all.
Never at all.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating.
Well, I'll tell you where they got that from. That was actually because the atomic bomb during World War II. Because it's a weird thing, but that's kind of how they always define their stories. It's because they were it's almost like they never really understood why they were defeated.
Sure.
They kind of worked throughout their entire cultural consciousness of, okay, at the end, in order to achieve victory, you have to pull something out of nowhere. This ultimate weapon that can, resolve everything. And that's where it's kind of from. It's an interesting thing. Society and the culture really forms how their stories are.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Well, I think that's a good end for this video.
Sure.
We talked a lot about conflict and just how it can define a story and
Sure.
the characters and just why it's so important. I think all of those are very important things to understand
Yes.
when you're trying to write a comic. So, yeah. Thanks so much for watching, guys.
See you guys next time.
All right. Bye.